Welcome to today's webinar. As a global consulting firm, Protiviti is here to help you connect, grow, succeed. We invite you to visit us online at protiviti.com/webinars to find other great content and subscribe. Now, let's begin.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, part 2 in our webinar series on our 2024 Global Finance Trends Survey Report. We're happy to have you join us, and we hope you find the information insightful. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items I'd like to run through with you. Audio is streamed through your computer, and today's session is being recorded for on-demand viewership later. Please do share it with your colleagues and revisit the content. If you're encountering any technical issues today, go ahead and use the Q&A box to message us. Also in the Q&A box, please send us any questions that you have for our speakers. We'll do our best to answer questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar at the end. If we run out of time, we'll do our best to follow up with you individually. And then for those seeking CPE credit today, we offer 1 credit hour. In order to meet the criteria for credit, you will need to stay on the webinar for a minimum of 50 minutes and also answer 3 of the 4 polling questions that are distributed throughout the session. At the end of the webinar, if you've met the criteria, you will be able to download a copy of your certificate on screen. A copy will also be emailed to you after the session today. And now I'd like to also take a moment to welcome our speakers. We have with us today Chris Wright, Managing Director and lead of our BPI practice. Also, we have David Taylor, another managing director, who will be providing us with a little bit of a technology background and experience. Charlie Serrano and Mark Belheim as well will be joining us. And today's agenda. First, we will go ahead and outline the CFO-CISO partnership, their collaboration on evolving regulatory requirements, compliance risks, cybersecurity risks, and data privacy expectations. We'll then move on and discuss new cyber regulations and reporting requirements, along with some lessons learned. From there, we will look at ESG data management for growing disclosure and reporting needs, and then wrap up by identifying some key action items for CFOs and finance leaders going into 2025. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Chris. Chris, please take it away.
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here to discuss the second aspect of our annual finance trend survey. We had about 1,000 respondents, just under 1,000 this year, just over 900 last year, just over 1,000 the year before. So we've got some good data from year to year where we track trends as they're reported to us by CFOs and people with adjacent titles in finance, depending on the size of their organization. Interestingly enough, what we like about this presentation and what others like about it as well is it's not us telling you what you should think. It's us reporting what about 1,000 of your colleagues or peers have to say about what interests them from an industry perspective, from a concentration of work or concern perspective about their finance function looking into 2025. From a demographic perspective, we had organizations of all sizes, but you'll see here about a quarter were 10 billion or larger, about a third 5 billion or larger, and 3 out of 5 were over $1 billion in sales from a size perspective. For the 9% of the respondents that were governments, almost 60% were 10 billion in size or larger, and for those that were in financial services, about half had 25 billion or more in assets under management, just to give you a sense of size. From a corporate organization perspective, just over 2/3 of the entities are public. Just under a quarter are private, and the government for the second year in a row had a fairly significant response rate and participated in the survey in a meaningful way. From a scope of organization perspective, about a third were what self-reported as global, meaning they operate in more than one country, national, obviously large companies within a country, and the rest regional, local, sort of self-explanatory. Importantly, though, a very global organization. So some of those global companies were headquartered outside the U.S. In fact, over half report being from countries outside the U.S. with a good cross-section in Europe and Asia Pacific and some Central and South America. What do they tell us? They gave us, and we have here the top 15, even though we tend to focus on the top 10. We cover the top 15 because we like to cover last year's top 10. What they told us was the security and privacy of data, which has been on the top, on our list for years, was their number one priority. FP&A, which we asked us 2 questions last year and asked us 1 question this year, where we suspected last year it might have been number 1 or number 2 had we asked it together. We did that this year, and it was. And ESG metrics and measurement, which was number 1 last year, is number 9 this year. And we believe that's because of the level of comfort as companies look into the issue. Also noteworthy, not a lot of daylight between number 1 and number 10 in terms of concentration. The score is between 7.3 on a scale of 1 to 10 and 7.7 on 1 to 10. But today, we're going to talk about some particular findings. So if you summarize the top 10 that I just showed you, security and privacy of data as the top priority. Number 1, FP&A, generative AI and data in finance and cost optimization. Those were all related topics. We covered those on a previous webinar, and sustainability disclosures and reporting being the CFO's problem. We've increasingly seen that as companies disclose non-financial data, it is often, perhaps even almost nearly always, that the finance function is responsible for that information. So today we're going to cover security and privacy of data, which is the top priority, and sustainability disclosures, which was the number 9 priority. And as Nicole pointed out, this is our second webinar. In our previous webinar, which is available on demand, we covered numbers 2, 3, and 4. And so let's move into a polling question before we get into the general content. So I'd like to ask you all to respond to this question. How would you describe the current relationship between your organization's CFO and this Chief Information Security Officer? And I would add, if you don't have a CISO, insert your Chief Technology Officer, whoever is responsible for security and privacy in your company. Is it highly collaborative? Is it moderately collaborative? Do you have limited interaction? Is it unfortunately adversarial, or is it not applicable because you're not sure or don't have any line of sight to that? If you could take a moment to answer that question. As Nicole mentioned, it's helpful to answer the questions in order to get CPE, and we'll debrief the answers and see how you compare to the other respondents.
And really quick, just a reminder to the audience today, you will need to make your selection to the poll question, but also make sure you click that submit button. You might need to scroll within the window on your screen, depending on how it's sized, to have your response recorded for credit.
That's great help, Nicole, because I know we want folks to get CPE. We've got about 85, almost 90% of you have answered the question, and we'll move into debriefing on that momentarily. And we do appreciate you doing that. It's important. We gather data through these webinars, and the audience for this webinar is about half the size of the survey itself. So it helps add to what we're able to observe. And so we're at about 90% response. And so David, why don't we see what they said, and then move to where we are. So if you look at it, looks like, David, about a third highly collaborative, and just even slightly more moderately collaborative. That's I guess a good sign. Very low adversarial, and 1 out of 6 not sure. That's completely understandable. So why don't you kind of walk us through what you've seen, and why you think the CFOs are as concerned as they are about cyber, and then we'll hear from Charlie on some of the specific rules that they're required to comply with.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Chris. Nice to be with you all today. I was kind of expecting this to kind of settle on the moderately collaborative. It's really nice to see highly collaborative. And so what I wanted to focus on was ways in which we have seen, and I personally have seen, CFOs and CISOs work together. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm in Florida, and it's pollen season apparently, and today's the day. So with that, we'll go on to what we saw in the survey, then I'll work into the topic. So inside the survey, we saw 61% of finance leaders and professionals rate the security and privacy of data as a high priority for the finance organization. So we're focused on finance. And then on the other side, 65% of finance leaders in publicly held companies rate it high, and 57% in private organizations Nice to see this at the top of the list. I'm a security practitioner. I do this every single day. And it's nice to see that the finance organization has a very strong and hard look at this. The one comment I would make about private organizations is that's kind of what we see. We tend to see public organizations spending more time and generally have a little bit more focus on security than we see private. And it just seems to be the way it shakes out. A lot of times that's going to be because of regulations, the new SEC reg that we'll talk about, and other obligations that they have. But what I wanted to focus on to help with that collaboration and to help with how the CFO and the CISOs can work together, 3 areas. One is around NIST CSF, and I'm not doing a deep dive. This is around how the finance organization and the CFO can collaborate with the CISO to improve the overall program at the company, the security program. The second is around a data protection program. We see a lot of companies having tools and an effort, but we're seeing a strong trend towards a strong data protection program and formalizing that for the company. And then the third is the new SEC requirements. And not to focus on that, Charlie's going to spend more time on it than I will, but it's around how do you prepare for a breach if you have one. And where I'm going to focus is on tabletop exercises, because we've seen a lot of collaboration between the executive team, the finance team, and the CISO team on tabletop exercises. Bear with me just a second. Thank you. If you're not familiar with NIST CSF, it came out in 2014. They just released version 2 of it this year. It has basically all of the functions that come up or should be dealt with when we're talking about a cybersecurity program. Many companies use this. I'm using this one only because it's probably the most popular one that we see. We do see ISO, we do see other frameworks come into play, but it's this NIST framework that we see most often. What we tend to see is companies will go through the process of evaluating their security program against this framework. And usually it's a it's an inquiry and limited inspection approach. They go around, talk to folks who are responsible for these different areas that are inside the framework. And as you'll see, there's 6 function areas. Those names are all along the top: govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. I'll note that govern is new for this newest version of the framework, but the approach that will be taken is talk to the folks that are responsible for these areas and then inspect and maybe do some observation around what's being done. We don't tend to see a deep dive into the actual, all the controls like you would see for SOX testing or something like that, right? That's generally what we see. The results of this are what tend to be beneficial for the collaboration between the finance organization and the CISO group. So this is an example of a maturity ranking that comes out of a NIST CSF review. And what you'll see here is the different tierings that are given to the different control areas, so that basically the company can be evaluated and either hire a firm, an outside firm, to come in and do an assessment, or they can self-assess. And what they do is there's tools available that allow you to create the maturity rankings. And then from there, you perform the assessment, develop the report, and then define your maturity or record your maturity. The bars that you see there, the black bars that you see there, are oftentimes the desired goal state for a company. And I will tell you that having a desired goal state is where the finance organization and the CISO group can work together, because you want to make sure that you're aligned, because what it comes down to is resourcing and spend. We have a client that we work with that does this every couple of years. And so what they do is they go through, they evaluate, and they record the prior assessment to the current assessment to see how they've grown. What's not going to be uncommon is for an area to decline. So you may have an area decline because of the fact that people changed, new tools came into place, new technology or whatnot. So this collaboration between the CISO group and finance is one way that they can communicate on a regular basis. So the next area is around having a data protection program. So many companies buy tools to basically allow them to understand how they're going to protect data. What we're seeing a strong trend in, and because of the regulations that are out, the SEC requirements, GDPR, we've seen it for a long time around PCI and HIPAA, but it's establishing a strong program that allows you to focus as a company on where you have data. This is a model that we created. It's similar to others, but the concept behind it is identify where you have data, classify it based upon a classification scheme that you develop, then protect it, and that's where the tools and the resourcing comes in, and then optimize your program. Optimizing your program is where you're going to look to see, are our tools doing what we expected out of them? Do we have the right people doing the right things? Have we onboarded new data that we now have to protect and incorporate into our program? And it's a very important process that you go through, and it's important that companies have the ability to protect data because of all the regulations that are out there. One method that we've seen companies go through that has been effective is to evaluate the tool stack that they have in place. What is very common is for companies to buy tools, purchase them, install them, but not fully implement them. And this is where finance can be a great partner for the security team, because it takes time and money in order to properly implement and integrate a tool into the environment. This right here is an example of some project work that we did for a client. We went through, we evaluated the tools that they had, and then basically created this matrix that shows where the tools are providing capability and where they're not. Because oftentimes what we'll see is a tool might be purchased, its initial capability might be enabled, but the full capabilities of the tool are not. Or there is a possibility of buying additional licenses for a tool that will give you more capability, and that also has not been purchased. So what I think is beneficial, and what we've seen has been beneficial, is that the cybersecurity team is given the right resources and the right money, basically, to be able to purchase the tool, implement it appropriately into the environment, and then also integrate it so that all the resources in the company are receiving a benefit from it. When you have a program like this, your ability to know when you've had a data issue, a data security issue, is enhanced significantly. Because when you have a classification scheme, when you've identified all of your data, you will know as an organization who's used it, where it's been sent, and how it's been sent. And the tools that apply to that vary based upon whether you have a lot of your data in the cloud, whether you have a lot of your data on-prem, and whether you have a lot of data on endpoint devices such as laptops and whatnot. And the tools that basically you can bring to bear are important to help you through that process. So key thing, the partnership between the CISO group and the finance team and the CFO, extremely important in this space. I will tell you, if you go through this effort to implement a data protection program for a larger company, this is not a multi-week effort, it's a multi-month effort or a multi-year effort based upon the amount of data you have, where it is. If you're a company that's gone through a lot of acquisitions and there's a lot of different data points to get through and a lot of different data repositories, it's going to be a longer project to get through. So don't think of this as a quick fix. Think of this as organizational change management and something that's going to take a bit of time to get through. The third area is SEC cyber disclosure. So not going to get into a lot of the details here. The key concept I wanted to focus in on is the breach requirement. So in order for a company to effectively respond to a breach, it's important that you have an incident response plan, the playbooks that go with it. You may have a incident response company on retainer. You might have a cyber insurance policy, a lot of things that go with it. One key concept to support all of that is a tabletop exercise. Tabletop exercises can come in a couple of different flavors commonly. You can use a tabletop exercise for anything that you want to role play in the organization. But when we're talking about cyber breach, the two most common types of exercises that we see are an executive tabletop and a technical tabletop. And how the finance organization or the CFO can play a key role in this is dependent upon the type of exercise that's performed. So let's talk about who the actors are that are in a tabletop exercise. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about basically how do you create one? What's the process you go through? So if it is a technical tabletop, the CFO is likely going to be an observer. An observer is someone who just participates in the testing, but they don't talk. They take notes, they evaluate. It allows them to see how the technical responders, the folks on the cybersecurity team, would basically participate in an exercise, participate in a breach if one were to happen. That's an observer. Participants are those folks in a technical tabletop. The participants are those folks that would be handling the response and dealing with all of the items that would come up that would need to be dealt with once a breach occurred. The facilitator and the facilitator assistants are those folks that are there basically to walk everyone through the process and to role play the scenario to make sure that everything from beginning to end happens. A lot of companies outsource this. Some folks do it themselves, but it is a very good exercise and a way for the CFO to participate. If this was an executive tabletop, the CFO would be a participant. And in executive tabletops is where the executive team gets together and talks about those items they might have to deal with in a breach, such as public disclosure, dealing with your cyber insurance policy, and anything that might be dealt with outside counsel, because that's a common thing that needs to happen. So that's the tabletop exercise and the folks that participate in it. If we walk through the way one is typically put together, the key part of this is having a trusted agent. There's generally going to be somebody who steps outside of their role, and they're going to be the one to help build this exercise in such a way that the participants and the observers don't know all the details. I will tell you the most common type of tabletop exercise that we do today is a ransomware exercise. The preparation that goes with it is generally weeks long, because the key thing you want to do is understand the objective. What are we trying to learn? What are we trying to test? It could be that you have a key person in the organization who generally handles everything. Could be the general counsel. They're always a strong player. They're involved in everything. Let's take that person out. Let's see how everyone else participates. So understand the objectives, build your scenario type, which could be ransomware, then role play it, go through the tabletop exercise, and then basically once it's done, you want to perform an after action. Everyone's going to sit around. The observers are going to come in. They're going to give their comments. Everyone's going to talk about things they did right, and they're going to talk about things that could be improved upon. So the tabletop exercise is one that allows collaboration between the CISO and the CFO and the finance organization. So those are the three areas I want to talk about. I am going to go into the next polling area and to go through it. How is your organization reacting to the cyber 10K and 8K disclosure rules? So like you did before, please use the voting. A, we are confident that existing processes already cover the requirements outlined by the new cyber rules. We are modifying existing processes to align with the new cyber rules. We are concerned that aligning with the new cyber rules will require extensive work or support. Or D, we are still trying to figure out what this is. So curious to see how folks answer this one. We've got about almost 50% of the attendees have voted so far. I have my own thoughts on where this will play out. The SEC rules, I think, have been a game changer. Charlie, curious to get your thoughts on this, but it's one that has been, I think, needed for a while in a certain way, because I think it puts people on notice about responding in an effective way. Not sure everybody agrees that the disclosure requirement is a popular one, but it is something that I think has a lot of potential benefit. So we're at 84%, 85%. We'll get to about 90 if we can get there, and then we'll go on to the next one. Please continue to vote. Got about 86. Looks like we might have topped off there. I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide. And Charlie, I will give it to you.
All right, David, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. Let's take a look at the results here. Very confident, 30%. Modifying existing process, which I almost 40%, which I expected to kind of shake out this way. We're concerned with the new rules, 7.8%. And I'll get into it in a little bit. 10K rules are effective, have been effective for about 10 months now. The cyber rules are the 8K rules, the incident rules are very dynamic and they can happen at any time. So that makes sense. Well, hopefully the 22% that said we're still trying to figure out what this means are private companies, perhaps, versus public entities. So let's get into some of the work as well in terms of the cyber rules, and effectively my day job is reporting compliance. So I do a fair amount of SEC advisory. As David points out, people may disagree on kind of these rules as promulgated by the SEC, but as the respondents put forth in our survey, and as David had laid out earlier, they're top of mind for most. Clearly, they're not going away. They've been sitting in SEC filers' risk factors for years, and this is natural, we believe. So let me just get into the highlights. The rules for the 10K, which are the annual disclosures, were effective for calendar year companies this year end. So everyone that was a calendar year company complied there. The 8K disclosures a little bit later, and they're certainly active now. So as I get into some of the rules, I'm going to focus on the rules a little bit, focus more on what we've seen, the leading practices, and what some of our analysis has set forth. So with that, so a little bit of rules and the details, right? So the cyber incident rules reporting, and this is if folks that are SEC registrant understand that 8Ks are anything that a company would deem material to an investor. You'll put out a notification on a change of executive, like a CFO, et cetera, an acquisition, disposition, and the like. So that's what 8Ks are for. Generally, they need to be out 4 days after an event, if you will. So cyber is no different. So the cyber incidents falling under Form 8K that get reported to the street. Obviously, reporting should focus on the nature, scope, and timing of any incident, or in many cases, a combination of incidents. Materiality determined, and full stop here, materiality in terms of how you should consider materiality, and more importantly, how the SEC views materiality, that has not changed, right? So the definition of materiality has not changed, both a quantitative focus and a qualitative lens on materiality. And so reporting should include party service providers as well. And reporting on the Form 8K no later than 4 business days after determining the incident to be material. The only caveat there is if an incident is so impactful that it would lead to, God forbid, a potential national security risk, you would wait prudently for that risk to be understood before you would disclose. In terms of the annual disclosures, focus on risk management, strategy, overall governance, and the framework, if you will, not the actual incident reporting, but the framework over incident reporting. So I'll get into that in a little bit. Key definitions. I'm not going to drain too much of this slide. The cybersecurity incident, I think, is understood well by this audience here. Materiality, just want to highlight again, it's what an investor would deem important. So it would be considered an event that would have some import for an investor. And again, to reiterate, the SEC's definition of materiality hasn't changed. However, the lens that needs to be looked at from a cyber perspective has been extended a little bit. So what are the potential shareholder groups that should align? Obviously, the cybersecurity professionals inside and outside your organization that support the function. Compliance should be, and governance should be front end. They should be, they should have policies, obviously, and standards at the front end. Internal audit, either looking at readiness or, event response. Internal audit has a role to play here as well. Legal, there may be fines and other sanctions that may come with a cyber event. So legal has a role to play here. The privacy of data that you might be housing for others is extremely important here. There's an ESG lens, of course, and Mark will cover ESG in great detail after this portion, but obviously the cyber governance falls strictly into the G of ESG. Accounting and finance, understanding the magnitude of the event and the dollars and cents of any remediation or any potential, any actual or any potential or indirect loss. And then the last piece, understanding any business continuity concerns. As you see, materiality has a wider lens. A little deeper on the two pieces generally of the 10K filing, the risk management and the governance. So this is what companies are required to do. Many companies that were calendar year were required to do high-level description of the risk management functions over cybersecurity. There are the risk management practices, risk scores, and the like. Disclosure of folks inside and both outside your organization, assessors, outside consultants, auditors, and other third parties that you may have engaged to assist with cybersecurity risks. So that's important as well. Whether any risk from cybersecurity threats, either prior or current, have material impacted or reasonably likely to impact company's business strategy, operations, or conditions. So those kind of protocols would be part of and are part of the annual 10K disclosures. In terms of governance, who's overseeing, of course, so overview of board committees or subcommittees responsible, including the audit committee, of course, for overseeing and assessing risks. And then the process by which management or its committees are informed, right, from the grassroots up, likely through the CISO office on cybersecurity incidents. So we took a look at, a boatload of Ks that were issued in all the calendar year companies that were issued, a boatload of them in early 24. And what we found through that process, we didn't see any significant changes to the risk factors that's in a company's financials related to cybersecurity. And that made sense to us in that risk factors are all encompassing, some would argue too much, but the cybersecurity portion have always been part of risk factors and have been for several years. Depending on the size and industry, the company may, for oversight and governance, may be at the AC level or designated subcommittee level. AC for small to mid-size, and we would think subcommittee within that reports up to the audit committee for larger companies. We saw the filings to date indicate a significant disparity in the frequency of cyber updates provided to the AC or the designated subcommittee. We would strongly recommend, and especially in the environment we live in today, that at least quarterly and as frequent as required based on incident response. So let's get into a little bit in terms of what we actually saw from the incidents that we took a look at. And we frankly looked at all in two tranches. We reviewed our first tranche, we reviewed filings in early 24 up through about springtime, May, if you will. Our second analysis covered that second tranche from May through current day. Some companies, some issuers made as required, or they felt as required, two updates. For example, if they felt something they could not determine materiality, and when they put out their first 8K, they subsequently said, hey, we took a look, we believe it's not material, or it was material, and this was the impact. So we saw that updates to an initial filing was certainly not out of the ordinary. So what did we see in that first tranche? Generally, companies being very, very conservative. A lot of companies, more than half, 65%, disclosed they had not yet determined where the incident had or reasonably likely to have a material impact, right? So if you step back and the SEC rules focus on material cyber incident reporting, right, companies were taking a very conservative view, which I don't think anyone had an issue with. They didn't have to put out an 8K that said we had a cyber event, we haven't determined materiality yet, but they did. They did anyway. And that was cleaned up in the second tranche, and I'll explain why in a second. Of that 65%, approximately 12% believed that ultimately the incident had no material impact. The form, this is very interesting, and I think it leans towards understanding determining materiality. So as mentioned, when a Form 8K needs to be filed within 4 days, subject to that one caveat, I talked about the average, and it ranged from 1 day, which makes sense, to 43 days, which doesn't make sense, and I'll get into that in a second, from the date of the incident with an average of approximately 8 days. And I think that 43 days was, we looked at it, was an outlier clearly, and anything that is beyond 4 days from the incident date is just determining the impact, potential impact of materiality. So our second tranche, it's really half and half. So half the registrants made a disclosure, they'd not yet determined the incident was material. Half said, we believe it is. The filing timing kind of tweaked down a little bit. It ranged from 5 to 25 days, a little shorter time frame, with an average of 13 days. What were our overall analysis themes? And I'll get into some best practices right after that. The filings which indicated we have not yet determined declined between our first tranche of analysis and our second tranche of analysis. And we just understand it's just a little less conservative, basically seeing what their peers put out, right? Because information is, of course, publicly available to everyone, and to better identify their impact in their initial filings, right? We saw, and this makes total sense, a sharp increase in the 801 filings. 801 is your general AK form, if you will. Form 105, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is the specific cyber material incident filing. So we saw a sharp increase in Form 801 filings, which means, hey, we may have an incident, we're not so sure if it's material or not, versus the prior tranche. To date, we've seen about a 50-50 split in issuers that filed either under the we're not sure 801 if it's material form, or 105 we believe it's material. We think that the impact of this we think two things. One, there might be less filings on we think we might have an incident, but we think there will also be more filings that focus, if they put that out, to say, we're going to follow the rules and file under Form 801 versus 105. And then less than 50% of issuers filed an updated report. So a couple other things. So the SEC, of course, given their role in investor protection, kind of asked a few companies about in comment letters officially on some of the disclosures. So a few of the ones we looked at, the SEC asked for expanded disclosure of a material event, describe the impact, and these are material events, of course, describe the impact in more detail, and expand the assessment to include qualitative aspects on materiality as well. In terms of improvements, and I think David touched on this already, greater cohesiveness, right, between the CFO office and the office of the CIO and CISO, right, determining a materiality framework. You don't want to start from square zero on a potential incident. Benchmark what your peers are putting out in terms of their 10K filings and what they put out in their 8K filings, and in industry and things that aren't publicly available, just industry symposiums to understand what folks are putting out there as well. And then one key item is adding to the board and perhaps also the audit committee we'll call it a cyber expert. And we think that hasn't happened yet in companies. It's quickly to happen. So I think we have a polling question. Not the ESG expert on this call. I'm going to hand off to Mark to run ESG and take us home.
Sounds great. Thank you, Charlie. For this polling question, how prepared is your organization for compliance with pertinent ESG reporting regulations? Couple options there. Go ahead and register your vote, and we'll kind of dive into the ESG component of this. Anxious to see where results were. I think from our finance trend survey, results were maybe a little bit better than I would have expected. So anxious to see what the the captured group that we have here today thinks of their readiness on this. I think we're getting close to having 80+% of people, so we'll go ahead and move along here with the polling results. So polling results show probably what I would have actually expected in our survey is moderately prepared going kind of leading that at 59%, extremely prepared, second best there at a quarter, and then not prepared at all, maybe just around 16% there. So that actually aligns with where most of my client discussions are lighting up these days. So very good to see at least some moderate preparedness as the ESG regulations are coming down here. So wanted to start off here and really talk about where ESG has been as a priority over the years. It's been on our survey for multiple years, was on #1 last year, and while no longer sitting at #1, it's definitely still a top priority for finance organizations. It was placed #9 overall for public and private companies alike. When you look at the split, and we'll talk about that in a little bit between public and private, public companies, it remains certainly a more significant priority as those organizations are subject to many different regulations across the globe, whereas private may be a little bit more localized here to the United States. But when you think about the regulations that are out there, the SEC climate rule, albeit stayed, the European Union's corporate sustainability reporting directive, amongst others, it's an ever evolving regulation landscape. And so I think that's kind of where you see the priority still being high in our survey at #9. So just to ground ourselves, what is ESG? I think it's been in the news quite a bit. I think a lot of us are really familiar with the E, the environmental and ESG. It's probably the most talked about item in news and shareholder meetings, et cetera. But ESG encapsulates areas such as social and governance as well. Things like human rights, data privacy, things that we just talked about in Charlie and Dave's components of this webinar are certainly within the social and governance space. Ethics, risks, controls, all these items are very important to an organization overall as we're thinking about those three different pillars. And so I think while we're mainly focused within the political realm on the E, the other parts of the S and G are certainly very important as we kind of talk about the disclosures related to those and the regulations that will be affecting those. So I call this my alphabet soup slide, and it's really a way to pictorially show the different and evolving landscape that is really happening within the ESG realm. And so, one of the questions that we asked was, what does it mean to be ESG reporting ready? And so we're looking at a change in the landscape right now. It used to be a marketing tactic around voluntary reporting, selecting hand-picked items or industry acknowledged metrics. And we're sort of moving toward a more rigorous set of reporting standards, thinking very much alike into that of a financial reporting regulation from the SEC or whatever governing body might be out there. And so when you liken it to a more financial reporting set of rules or disclosures or principles, you're going to find some commonality across industries and companies. And so I think that's really important to know, one, because you're going to get some apples to apples comparisons, but the regulation and the strictness around the data and the disclosures is going to be ever evolving. Many of the regulations have audit requirements within them. And so that kind of brings me to my next component is, the regulations are continuing to raise the bar as it relates to the disclosures that are required, the accuracy, the completeness of those, where kind of in the voluntary reporting space, you're not really having to represent exactly how accurate those are. When you think about the EU's corporate sustainability reporting directive, and that's a little bit of a tongue twister, so I'll refer to that as CSRD from now on, the amount of data that's required within there is truly amazing. It's by far the most pervasive standard that's out there and does have some clawback to the United States as well and the ultimate parents that live with or are domiciled within here. Other regulations such as the climate rule, I know I mentioned that it stayed for now, but climate bills 253 and 261 within California, all of these items are kind of adding to the what do I do? How do I get ready to be ESG reporting ready across all of these different regulations? On the right-hand side of this slide, we've got various frameworks and boards and committees that are putting out different rules or prescriptions really to how companies might think or utilize frameworks to comply with these rules. So you see TCFD up there, GRI, and really what I'm trying to envision here is just that it becomes more complex as we move toward more of a compliance focus. We're not aligning rules, we're not necessarily aligning committees across the globe here. And so kind of navigating this is a little bit of a dark space right now. And so being reporting ready can mean a little bit different things here. And I think the other aspect to this is when we think about regulation, right, it often comes with a cost. I'm talking about the compliance cost, not only in getting ready, but you're no longer able just to say, I don't care about that anymore. You have to hit it head on, as there's going to be consequences, where that's, I think in France for CSRD, they're talking about jail time for executives or fines along the way. And so there continues to be this focus from finance leaders on ESG because of how paramount it is to the success of the organization, or rather the required compliance and the associated penalties that might be required for it. You might be sitting there and saying, Mark, you just freaked me out with a whole bunch of potential jail time or consequences financially for my organization. How could I start? And so really the first step is understanding each of these regulations and how that affects your organization. Where are the jurisdictions that affect you? How does that play in? How might that claw back to your ultimate parent? And then really from there, a lot of this is really housed within the concept of materiality. I know Charlie talked about materiality for cybersecurity. For the SEC, it's very much the same. It's what's material to the investor. And while that's not hard and fast, it is very consistent with, the position that the SEC has taken over the years. Within the EU, within their CSRD, they've implemented this concept of a double materiality, which is really thinking about outside in, how things affect you, the financial implications to your organization based upon the risks and opportunities that are out there as it relates to some ESG related components, but also your impact out on the world. It's an outside in perspective. And so that's called the impact side of things within this double materiality assessment. And I only bring that up as it's very nuanced in the way the EU is thinking about things, but through all these materiality assessments or processes, you really drive to the fact of what are the material subtopics and what do we need to get to. And so from there, really want to focus on, I'm going to skip over this slide, but this is just showing the amount of topics that are out there under the CSRD. There are a lot of different topics within here, a lot of different data points that might be required. And so getting ready for these is really a struggle for a lot of organizations that may be a little bit behind or may have been feeling moderately prepared, but really seeing it on a page really puts it out there. And so I did want to do a quick comparison between what we heard from you all and what we're seeing within our survey. As I mentioned, many of the organizations were moderately prepared or feeling very prepared, 4 or 5 scoring on our survey. There was a little bit of a difference when we looked at the public to private company split, and that was really dependent upon the fact that I think a lot of the public respondents are going to need to comply with this on a much quicker basis and maybe at a more global level. And so you might say, Mark, why is there such a high degree of preparedness across the group? As I kind of mentioned in my intro to the section, I think ESG has been our top priority on our survey for quite some time now. And while it's not as important this year, because it's been a top priority for so long, I think organizations have taken steps such as picking a framework, voluntary reporting some ESG metrics, validating some of those metrics internally over the past 5 to 10 years. And those steps have allowed those companies to feel comfortable in having repeatable processes or validated data that they can use for regulatory reporting. Now, for those of us who may feel that we haven't been taking the incremental steps along the way, the horizon out there for ESG reporting is certainly imminent. And similar investments and changes that the prepared organizations have taken will need to be taken in a shorter time frame and will likely put strain on human capital as well as capital resources to undertake that level of change that's necessary here. There is a chart here on the right that is a little bit different. We said on the left-hand side, how's your organization feel? On the right-hand side says, how's the finance org feel? And you see that it kind of shifts down in terms of preparedness. And the reason for that shift, and our respondents don't provide insight into that question, but I think what's happening is the finance organizations are becoming the de facto owners of ESG reporting, even though they may have only had limited exposure in the past to that voluntary reporting. And so while finance leaders are experts at internal controls, data, risk management, and external reporting, they're not as familiar with the subject matter, but that core foundation that we all take kind of for granted as we know how to audit, the data is good, that's not as well defined now within the ESG reporting standpoint. And so some of that responsibility is shifting over to the finance organization. So with that said, finance orgs are saying, I'm really struggling here. How can I solve for some of the gaps that I have, or improve the capabilities that we have within my organization to get ready for ESG reporting? And I think it really falls into two major groups. The first is really on the human capital side. So as I mentioned, finance really has a great understanding around controls and data and things like that, but maybe not as well on the ESG side. So really getting the training that they need, upskilling themselves, and then really even from a broader organizational perspective, what are the regulations that are out there and how might that affect each of us or each of the groups that are within there? And so I think you're going to see some investment from a people, but also you may see investment in terms of bringing on additional roles. And so one of the roles that we've seen kind of being newly created is this role of an ESG controller. And so what that really does is it brings together both accounting and ESG into a leadership role to spearhead some of these initiatives as we're getting more closer to actually reporting on this from a compliance standpoint. The second, and I'm sure it's no surprise here, is IT, thinking about data tooling. If you've got an ESG program right now, your information is probably very disparate, not well governed. And so putting in the right mechanisms and tooling within there to capture the data and provide some of that assurance around accuracy, completeness, et cetera, is really important. And then layering on top of that, we were talking about the data gathering of that, thinking about your GHG emissions, again, picking on E because it's easy within ESG, but also layering on reporting. We utilize reporting tools right now with our 10K or 8K filings or 10Q filings, thinking about how to best leverage some of that ecosystem that you have right now is certainly important. I think the main takeaway here is, and I'll be quick here as I know we're getting on time, is the regulation and ESG world is continuing to evolve. We need to continue to prep and make sure that we're ready to hit those milestones. And the main things here is making the right investments in people and technology in order to help make that smooth. So I would encourage each of you to take a look at, your organization and how prepared you are, maybe a real deep self-reflecting look in the mirror, and think about where are our gaps and how we might start to shore those up. With that, we'll go to our last polling question. Which of the upcoming ESG regulations is your organization most concerned with? We've got the EU, CSRD, SEC, climate bills from California. If I was sitting in someone's seat and had a global impact, I know which one I would be clicking, but Chris would be interested to hear maybe anything from your perspective on this as we're kind of getting the results in here.
Sure, Mark. It's interesting. One of the questions that came in during the webinar was whether the results were different. Is there sort of a U.S. versus the rest of the world on a number of the questions? And the one area where there was some differentiation, and as I mentioned earlier, only 45% of our respondents were from the U.S. So with that kind of concentration, there couldn't be that much. But clearly, ESG was a little bit more present in Europe because of the number of companies that are headquartered in Europe that have to deal with CSRD before the rest of us do. And that would be U.S. companies where the European presence would be next. And so it's interesting where the geographic differences came into play. It was largely in the ESG area. And of course, California, obviously, with the large global companies that were headquartered there, we would imagine when we peel that back, that we would see a higher concentration there as well. I see the results are coming in. Of course, as you mentioned also, Mark, the SEC action is judicially and administratively stayed, but as we help companies get ready for IPOs or be acquired by a public company, or public companies doing due diligence on private companies, it's very much on the checklist of just in case, or be ready when it needs to be. See if we can get a few more in, and then we will move on to some final thoughts. I'm going to move on then, Mark, to the wrap up. And thank you to Mark and to David and to Charlie for providing that kind of color commentary. And as we look at the results here, not a great surprise based on the demographics of who might be on this call. This is probably more of a domestic United States-based call. So the SEC climate disclosure rule would be number one. You could imagine a number of companies that either are headquartered or do business in California would be on the call, and then either European companies or U.S. companies that are large enough to have a European presence would be concerned with the CSRD, and other, because the SEC rule isn't effective, right? And the marketplace is what's requiring and has led to 99% of the S&P 500 voluntarily disclosing ESG data. So that's an interesting lineup of information, and probably we run that against the demographics of who attended. It'll make perfect sense. And so with that, I'd like to just cover some key action items from what David and Charlie and Mark were able to share with us today. One of the key action items is we asked a question: what is the relationship between the CFO and the CIO or the CISO? And what we suggest there is whatever it is, elevate it to some other level. Particularly, cyber is the number one issue for CFOs. A third of our respondents weren't even public companies. It was still number one by a decent amount. It affects all entities in all industries and all geographies, including the government entities that participated. Understand what regulatory guidance and enforcement actions are out there relative to cyber. Have a chain of accountability so that you can get from something happened to telling who needs to know what and when. Understanding from an ESG perspective which of those many requirements that Mark shared with us would apply to you. Is California? Is it the EU? Is it the US SEC? Is it a client or customer or vendor demand, a banker or lender or some community organization or even an employee group? Who is it that's asking for that information? Then be prepared to create a repository of data so that there's sort of one sort of the truth. Similar to your general ledger, you'll want the equivalent of an ESG GL so that it's the same information being answered for the same question consistently and timely. And then integrate it into your enterprise risk management processes so that it's connected to other parts of the organization. We have time for one or two questions. And I know we had, in addition to that question on the US versus the world, I think, David, there was a question on what kind of interval would you think would be appropriate between health checks for cyber? How often?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question, and it comes up a lot. And so I can tell you what we see at clients, and I can give you my own opinion. So what we see at clients is we have some clients that do it all throughout the year. They will dig in at the first part of the year, at some set point in the year, do the full assessment, and then basically checkpoints along the way. Larger company, and then they'll do deep dives into certain categories. So kind of throughout the year, fluid, one big, and then throughout. Have another client that I work with, they do it every few years. And so basically they don't have the resources to devote to doing this testing, every single year. If I was to, my own opinion, I think it's a good annual assessment in some form, right? Because it gives you the ability to report to executives, to report to the board on the status of cybersecurity. So a lot of variability in when and the timing of that.
Great, thank you, David. And we have one other question was from an ESG sustainability reporting perspective. Is there a different level of interest among finance team members in doing the work that's generational? I answer yes. Once we get past the fact that everybody has to do it, whether they like it or not, depending on who's demanding it, whether it's a customer, vendor, lender, employee group, or regulator, we are finding that the newer entrants to the workforce, similar to AI, they're more in tune with it. They've studied it. It's been part of coursework, part of their recent experience, tends to be more engaged in that. And that helps to create a partnership within the finance organization between the senior leaders and the newer entrants to the workplace. And so with that, we are at time. And I'd like to thank you all for attending. Resources and thought leadership are going to be provided, as well as the deck will be provided to all of you, which will give you access to our full report if you don't already have it, access to this webinar on replay as well as our original webinar, and then of course to a number of other items we've put together such as podcasts, related materials to this survey. So thank you all for joining, and we appreciate your time and attention and your questions. Have a great rest of your day.